Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where President Trump's economy is once again being put to the test, with the Federal Reserve again slashing interest rates in response to sluggish job growth and an uncertain economic outlook as the president prepares for a high-stakes face-to-face meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the critical issue of trade. Wall Street reacting to the news from the Fed, with markets closing just moments ago. The Dow a bit lower after Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell announced a quarter-point cut to its benchmark interest rate in an effort to spur demand in the economy, making it the second consecutive time the central bank cut interest rates this year. In his press conference, Chair Powell also spoke about the impact of delayed economic data due to the government shutdown. Take a look.
Some important federal government data have been delayed due to the shutdown. The public and private sector data that have remained available suggests that the outlook for employment and inflation has not changed much since our meeting in September. Conditions in the labor market appear to be gradually cooling, and inflation remains somewhat elevated.
Well, it all comes as we're only a few hours away from President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping's meeting on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Forum in South Korea. On Meet the Press this Sunday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told me the U.S. and China have already agreed to a framework of a trade deal. And while speaking to a gathering of executives gathered in South Korea, President Trump similarly struck an optimistic note about the upcoming meeting.
President Xi of China is coming tomorrow here. And we're going to be, I hope, making a deal. I think we're going to have a deal. I think it'll be a good deal for both. I'll be meeting him tomorrow. A lot of people are interested. They're also interested in what we're doing, but they're interested in that. I can tell you a lot. The world is watching. And I think we'll have something that's very exciting for everybody.
Following those remarks, President Trump was overheard telling South Korea's president he expects his meeting with Xi to last up to 3 or 4 hours. Joining me now is NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung and NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, who is in South Korea traveling with President Trump. Brian, let me start with you here in studio. You were just at the Fed, your old stomping ground. In fact, talk to us about this decision. What's behind it and why the second rate cut?
Yeah, well, it's great to be with you here in person, but we just heard from the Federal Reserve Chairman just a few minutes ago as they made that announcement of a quarter basis point cut. This is the second interest rate cut they've made so far this year, and the reason why is because of concerns over the labor market, where there's been some slowdowns, and as of late, too, a lot of high-profile companies making announcements of layoffs as well. You think about UPS, over 40,000 jobs. You think about Amazon, over 10,000 jobs. So certainly in the absence of government data, that is what is catching a lot of general people's attention. But at the Federal Reserve, too, they've already been having this concern for the past few months that there could be this slowdown in the economy. I asked the Fed chairman, hey, what do you see in terms of this labor market status? Is the slowdown getting worse? Here was his response. Who's at risk if the interest rate cuts are not the effective medicine for a further slowdown in the labor market?
So we do not see the weakness, as you put it, the weakness in the job market accelerating. I mean, no story. You can look at the numbers. Same thing with the job openings we get from Indeed. There's just no story over the last 4 weeks. It's kind of stable. So you don't see anything that says that the job market is, or really any part of the economy is making a significant deterioration. Don't see that.
So that doesn't sound like too much worry from the Fed chairman, but nonetheless, they're still cutting interest rates because there's the concern that that could happen. I think the Fed now is in this place where they're making these interest rate cuts, and they just want to see whether or not it has the intended impact of stopping any slowdown in the labor market.
Well, it's a fascinating exchange and a great question, and I think one that's on the minds of a lot of people as they continue to see headlines about these job cuts. Let me ask you, though, about the shutdown, Brian, because it has loomed large over everything, not just in Washington, but all across the country. To what extent is that impacting, and may that have impacted the Fed's decision today? Yeah, well, the Fed chairman had a number of questions where he talked about this exact issue. You have to remember that the shutdown began on October 1, and just a few days after that, the Federal Reserve was expecting a jobs report that would tell us exactly what the jobs market looks like. And the issue is that that was not published. We did end up getting an inflation report after the fact because they needed to make the cost of living adjustments to Social Security payments. But absent that, we're not going to get any more data. So if you're thinking about this from the perspective of a pilot flying a plane, the instrument cluster is all jammed here. And the Fed chairman had his own analogy where he said, if you're driving through the fog, what do? You slow down.
ground. And so he's in this place where you really have no choice. It's not like you can force the Bureau of Labor Statistics to release these, the data. You can't go banging on the door. But I worked at the Fed. That was my first job out of school, and I worked on crunching the numbers for The Economist. If you don't have the numbers, there's nothing you can deliver to The Economist, and The Economist can't make those decisions. That's where the Fed is right now. They're using other private sources of data, but that's only so good when the gold standard is usually the government data.
That's why you have such a deep understanding of what we're talking about. Brian, this wasn't a unanimous decision today, though. Talk a little bit about that and the significance. What are the implications?
Yeah, so, the Fed chairman is the person we kind of think of as the face of the Federal Reserve, but we have to remember there are a number of people. There are 12 people that get to decide on what the interest rates are. 2 of them did not support this decision. And what was interesting about this is that one person, the head of the Kansas City Fed, actually advocated for not cutting interest rates at all, so basically keeping them the same. Meanwhile, another Fed governor, this is Stephen Myron, who is the president's pick for the Fed board in his second term, he advocated for a more steep interest rate cut, kind of to no one's surprise based off of his recent commentary. He advocated for 0.5 percentage point as opposed to 0.25 point. Where they ended up was kind of in the middle, but directionally they're still going in the way of interest rate cuts. The question is, will they cut interest rates again in December? The Fed chairman, interestingly today, saying that is not a done deal. It is not an absolute that we'll get another interest rate cut in December. You've seen markets kind of repricing in the last hour or so off of that. But again, what happens between now and December? A lot. But will we have a government open to tell us what the data is? That's the open question.
Undoubtedly, that will be a big, big factor. And everyone's going to be wondering, will there be yet another rate cut? Brian Chung, thank you so much. It's great to have you here.
Likewise. Thanks,
in
Kristen.
person, fresh off coming from the Fed. We really appreciate it. Garrett, let me turn to you. Traveling with the president, this decision by the Fed, of course, comes as President Trump set to meet with China's president, Xi Jinping. What are you going to be watching for in that meeting, Garrett?
Well, look, a 3-hour meeting, this could cover half a dozen or more topics. Kristen, I think in the White House's best case scenario, when the meeting is over, you'll see a situation where the tariffs are lower on products from both sides. Rare earth minerals are easier to get in the United States, and fentanyl is harder to get. That's sort of the core discussion points, I think, that have been outlined by the Treasury Secretary, the President, and others for what they expect to be talking about today. If things go really well or the conversation goes much broader, we could get some news about TikTok. We could get some news about China perhaps cutting back its purchases of Russian oil, something the president has said he intends to ask President Xi about. There's a pretty wide universe of potential topics here for the world's 2 largest economies. I think it's just a matter of keeping the train on the tracks, as it were, throughout the course of this meeting and sticking to that framework as it exists for guiding this conversation. Well,
President Trump was asked about how much of this meeting will focus on Taiwan. He sort of downplayed that part of the conversation. I've asked him about Taiwan before. He always keeps his cards very close to the vest when it comes to that issue. What is the administration's strategy here, Garrett?
Well, look, the administration's policy on Taiwan, as has been the policy going back for decades, is strategic ambiguity. Essentially, the less the United States says about what Taiwan is and what its future looks like, the better. And so from the White House perspective, the less that President Trump commits to with President Xi about any topic related to Taiwan, the better. Kristen, you and I have covered the president for a long time. When he wants to be ambiguous and unclear, he does it quite well. So if he sort of sticks to the goal here for the White House and says very little, or at least very little concrete about Taiwan's future, they'll consider that a win.
That is absolutely right, Garrett. And just quickly before I let you go, obviously you're there in South Korea where President Trump did have some meetings today. What were some of the key takeaways there? Any big news on the trade front?
Well, the South Koreans, like the Japanese, have figured out how to try to appeal to President Trump. There are gifts, there is pomp and circumstance, there is the discussion of awards and the bestowing of honors. The South Koreans, I look at this in comparison to the Japanese because the economies are so similar. A lot of the interests are similar. They're playing catch up to a certain degree, trying to get more of their investments off the ground in the United States, trying to clear up some of these immigration-related issues that we saw in the United States with that raid in Georgia. They're their ace in the hole here, if you will, is their shipbuilding expertise, something that has come up to some degree with the White House, because that's an issue that the president cares a great deal about. But much like with the Japanese, a lot of the specifics of this deal, these investments, what the relationship is going to look like are still yet to be determined after what was a relatively short visit focused just on the Korea part of this visit here on the peninsula.
All right. Well, the final leg of this 6-day trip. Garrett Haake, thank you so much for joining us with your reporting. We really appreciate it. For more now, I'm joined by Bonnie Lin, director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Bonnie, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Kristen, thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. Let's start with President Trump's meeting with President Xi Jinping, the Treasury Secretary, telling me over the weekend that he believes there is a framework for a deal. What are you anticipating, and what would the implications be for the tensions that we have seen mount between the U.S. and China?
Well, thank you, Kristen. I think Garrett covered lots of the different components of the deal. So we're thinking that the United States would likely hold off on the 100% tariffs that President Trump threatened recently. So we'll probably have tariffs around 55%. It's likely that China would delay imposing its rare earth export controls on the United States. Currently, it's scheduled to begin in December 2025, but China could push it for another year. It's likely fentanyl will be part of the deal. We expect that President Trump is not going to completely get rid of the 20% fentanyl tariff, but maybe go down to as low as 10%. And of course, having China buy more U.S. soybeans will be part of the deal. I don't know how much that will be, but we've already seen, even before the two presidents meet, that China has already purchased a little bit more in terms of fentanyl. We've seen reports that China has purchased about 180,000 metric tons of fentanyl, which is still less than 1% of its total purchases from 2024. But that's a good sign. TikTok might be on the list in terms of what to do next. We also know that President Trump made a comment about NVIDIA chips, and Jensen Huang is currently in South Korea. So I'd be interested to see to what extent President Trump will be pushing for China to purchase more NVIDIA chips, whether that is the lower end ones or whether that is the high-end Blackwell ones, which President Trump has mentioned publicly. And the last item that I will mention that President Trump will probably be pushing for is China purchasing less Russian oil. And I do expect Taiwan to pop up in the conversation, too, because of the interest from the Chinese side.
Well, you take me to my next question. I want to play for you what President Trump told reporters about Taiwan. Here's what he said. Take a listen.
We'll even speak about Taiwan. I'm not sure. I mean, he may want to ask about it. There's not that much to ask about it. You know, Taiwan is Taiwan.
There's not that much to ask about. Taiwan is Taiwan. Do you expect President Xi to raise this issue?
Absolutely. We've already seen President Xi Jinping raise this issue in a phone call with President Trump already this year. It's China's core interest, so China will raise it. I don't think either side is expecting much movement on that. For example, I don't think the Chinese are going into this meeting expecting that President Trump will negotiate Taiwan away. And I also think President Trump realizes how important Taiwan is, both for thinking about the United States and what we need in terms of semiconductors, but also if he were to even consider any change in U.S. policy on Taiwan, he would need to get a lot more from the Chinese than what he's getting right now.
You know, it's interesting because we've seen different leaders take different tactics towards dealing with President Trump. President Xi Jinping has flexed his muscles, quite frankly, heading into this high-stakes meeting. Talk a little bit about President Xi as a leader and how you anticipate he will comport himself in this meeting.
You're exactly right. He has flexed his muscle. On September 3rd, we saw China hold a military parade to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the ending of World War II. And that parade was unprecedented in the sense that you had Xi Jinping flanked by Vladimir Putin, as well as Kim Jong-un. And of course, the Iranian president was among other world leaders behind these three. So in this case, we're seeing Xi Jinping positioning himself very well before a meeting with President Trump. We also know that during that parade and after that parade, it instilled quite a bit of confidence within the Chinese political system. So I think President Xi Jinping is entering the meeting with President Trump from his perspective on very firm ground. And China also just recently had their plenum that looked at China's economic plan for the next 5 years. And from what I'm seeing in terms of at least Chinese reporting on their economic development, all the Chinese reporting is very positive. And it's, I think Xi is entering the meeting thinking that he's also doing well economically. And if he doesn't get significant concessions from the United States, but I also believe most of it has already been negotiated before the meeting, China is able to play tit for tat against the United States.
Well, the eyes of the world will be on this meeting. Bonnie Lynn, thank you for helping us set the stakes. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your insights. Coming up, when will the government shutdown end? The president of the largest federal workers union speaks out, and a top Democratic congressman weighs in. Both of those in-studio interviews are straight ahead. Plus, Hurricane Melissa's wrath, the historic storm's widespread destruction in Jamaica is starting to come into view. NBC News is on the ground covering the impact, the recovery efforts, and the storm's path. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. It is day 29 of the government shutdown with no end in sight, as funding for critical food assistance programs for tens of millions of Americans set to lapse in just 2 days, and health care premiums set to spike without a deal in Congress to extend ACA tax credits. All of it as essential federal workers missed their first full paycheck today. It comes as the largest union representing federal workers is now calling on Congress to pass a clean, short-term funding bill to reopen the government. That means no strings attached. That's in line with what Republicans are currently demanding of Democrats, who continue to hold firm that they will not vote to reopen the government unless health care subsidies are restored. Republican Senate Majority Leader John Thune saying it's not often he agrees with the federal workers union, but that they are absolutely right. Joining me now is the president of the American Federation of Government Employees, Everett Kelly. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Kelly. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me here.
So I want to make sure I'm getting your position right. You are saying to Democrats, it's time to vote to reopen the government, pass that short-term bill that Republicans have passed? What's your message?
I'm saying to everyone, right, that it is time to stop playing politics with federal employees, open the government, and deal with the issues that you have before you. But, and I know that people have misconstrued what I've said. That, I'm saying to anyone that has the power to come to the table and deal with these issues, to come deal with these issues. That's my concern.
And just to be very clear, Republicans have passed a bill to reopen the government, no strings attached, what we call a clean CR. That's the fastest way to reopen the government, arguably. Do you want to see a vote on that and the government reopened?
I want to see the government reopened because, and this is the reason why. I represent 820,000 federal and D.C. government employees, and those employees are suffering right now. They are wondering how they're going to pay their child care bill. They're wondering how they're going to buy groceries. They're wondering how they're going to pay the mortgage. These are the things that real employees and real Americans face. And they are no different than the rest of America. 65% of Americans live from paycheck to paycheck. These employees are no different, and they need to be paid.
Do you blame one party over the other?
I'm not, and that's the thing. I'm not. I understand that the health care issue is a real issue that need to be addressed. I mean, when you look at Everett Kelly sitting here today, I came from a household that didn't have a whole lot. I came from a household that depended on government subsidies, okay? Mm-hmm. So I understand the reality of it, I understand the need, but at the same time, there are people suffering. Now, you just think about it. How many other people would want to come to work and not get paid?
Well, and there are people suffering, and they're speaking out. I want to play for you something that Virginia Senator Mark Warner, whose state obviously has a lot of federal workers, had to say on Monday. Take a look.
Federal workers, for the most part, are saying, hang in there. They feel like they've been abused virtually on a daily basis since this administration.
So it's not that their statement isn't going to change how you vote.
Let's see how the week plays out.
He's saying that federal workers are telling him to hang in there in this fight over health care. That's not what you're hearing, though?
Well, now, to be quite honest, there are federal workers that says, hold the line, okay? However, that's not the vast majority. When I talk to the members that I represent through phone calls, through travel, whatever, the vast majority of the workforce are saying, we need our paycheck. As a matter of fact, I did some polling as well, and they're saying, we need you to fight to make sure that we get paid because we need to pay for groceries and all these things that I named before.
Well, Senator Warner also said that federal workers feel, quote, abused by this administration. Are you hearing that? Is that true?
Sure. And that's why we have taken this administration to court. This is not about partisan politics. This is about the employees that I represent. Because just yesterday, the federal judge ruled in our favor on an action that we filed against this administration. We're here to make sure that federal employees, I'm elected to make sure the federal employees are represented. And that I will always do.
Some people might see you speaking out and say they agree with what you're saying and they wished you'd said it sooner. Why are you speaking out now? Why not on day one of the government shutdown?
I did. I spoke out.
With this message that it's time to get a bill done?
I spoke out and said that there should never, ever be a government shutdown. Okay, but last Thursday I woke up, turned my television on. The first thing I saw was suffering federal employees standing in line to get food. And I knew then something has to be done. Somebody has to say something to force some communication between the two. And I think that is paying off.
All right. It's paying off because you get the sense that there might be some movement?
I do. I think that there is some movement.
Okay. Can you tell us any more? You think there might be a deal?
I hope that we will see some movement real soon.
All right. Everett Kelly. Thank you so much for being here, sir. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
As the shutdown drags on, the pressure is on more and more Americans, set to become more severe, and both parties are framing the looming lapse in food assistance for millions of Americans, known as SNAP, and the looming spike in health care premiums as a way to force the other side to make concessions.
Look, on November 1st, people in more than 30 states are going to be aghast when they see their bills, and they're going to cry out. And I believe there will be increased pressure on Republicans to negotiate with us.
SNAP recipients shouldn't go without food. People should be getting paid in this country. And we've tried to do that 13 times. And you voted no 13 times. This isn't a political game. These are real people's lives that we're talking about. And you all have just figured out, 29 days in, that, there might be some consequences.
Joining me now to discuss all of this, Pennsylvania Democratic Congressman Chris Deluzio. Congressman Deluzio, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me in.
So you just heard Mr. Kelly say it is time to reopen the government. There is a Republican clean CR, a bill with no strings attached. You could open up the government today. Why not do that and then debate these health care subsidies, put people back to work, get their paychecks rolling again?
Well, look, number one, you've got people seeing the prices they're going to pay for premiums right now. Open enrollment starts November 1st. That is a crisis hitting families across the country. In my district, certainly no exception. House Republicans passed their bill without Democrats. They didn't want to work with us. They have the majority in the House and the Senate. They control the White House. They're in control in Washington. If they wanted to proceed without Democrats, they could do that. I think it's foolish to ignore these tax credits that are expiring. People across the country are about to get hit with big increases to health care costs. We've got to take action on this. And frankly, I think it's been foolish to ignore that while we're in a place of a lot of pain for federal workers.
What do you say, though, to Americans who are looking at this and they say federal workers are being used as pawns in this fight, quite frankly, by both sides?
Look, I think the government should never have shut down. Republicans should not have proceeded this way. They could have worked with Democrats to have a responsible funding deal, a bipartisan deal. And I've been in Washington now several times since the House has been out of session. Mike Johnson's chosen not to have members here. I have no one to negotiate with in Washington. I think my constituents want us negotiating, working out a deal to reopen the government, fund it. I don't want to see federal workers go without pay.
Again, their argument is, look, they have passed a bill that Democrats could come to the table and vote on in the Senate and pass, and the government would reopen.
If they wanted to reopen the government with that bill, they could do it. They've advanced judicial nominees without votes in the Senate from Democrats. They know how to proceed without a filibuster. They passed a terrible tax bill, in my opinion, without the filibuster, and they chose not to do anything on these expiring tax credits. So when they want to, they're certainly in power enough to work without Democrats.
Are you advocating to kill the filibuster?
They should have, and they already have. They don't use it for judicial nominees. They don't need it for budget reconciliation.
Let me ask you about something that one of your Democratic colleagues, Senator John Fetterman, who has voted with Republicans on this clean CR to reopen the government. Let me play for you some of what he said.
I mean, you have 42 million Americans that are going to lose their SNAP benefits at the end of the week. And now also about WIC. And now also, do you really want to fray and tax our flying, the FAA? You know, like delays across the board? Do you want to do these kinds of things? You know, we could just pay everybody, reopen everything, and now we can address the tax credit extensions.
What do you say to that argument and to your colleague, Senator Fetterman?
Well, he's right to be concerned about people missing SNAP benefits starting in November. The place where I might disagree is the administration has a fund they can point to and they can draw from right now to make sure those funds go out. And they should. I don't know why the Trump administration is choosing not to. And let's be clear, the time is now. We should have been taking action weeks, months ago on these tax credits. They're expiring. I heard from people in my district, a couple in their 60s, making around typical income from my part of the world. They're looking at $1,200 a month of extra payments and premiums. Yeah. That would blow up any family's budget around that income level. Congress has to take action here.
Well, and the argument, it's not just about SNAP, it's about federal workers missing paychecks as well. The lines outside of food banks growing longer. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, who's also voting with Republicans, has said she took the vote because she doesn't want to swap one group's pain for another. Is that the situation that Democrats find themselves in? And quite frankly, could it backfire?
Look, I come back to the fact that Republicans have full control here. They could do this without Democrats. That's how they've proceeded.
They do need Democrat votes in the Senate.
Well, let's argue about that. They don't. They've advanced judicial nominees. They've passed a big tax and spend bill.
But you're calling for getting rid of this filibuster altogether?
Well, they already have gotten rid of it where they want to. They have the votes to change the rules when they want. They should work with Democrats then if they won't proceed on their own. They have full control here. And I think it's foolish to have refused to take action on health care. I was in the military. I know what it's like to be in federal service. I've got friends who are still in and classmates of mine. People are really suffering in this shutdown. We should get the government reopened. Let's have a deal. Let's take action on health care tax credits.
It's interesting because Republican Majority Leader John Thune in the Senate has said he believes that there may be enough moderate Democrats to actually move on a compromise that would include an extension of reopening the government and a guarantee to negotiate over health care subsidies. Are you getting the sense that something is moving behind the scenes, as you heard Mr. Kelly
that's
suggest?
promising. I hope something is moving behind the scenes, and it seems to be the actions in the Senate, because at least the Senate Democrats and Republicans have been in Washington. I wish the House Republicans were here for us to negotiate with them, too. People expect us to be working out a deal right now. They don't want to see collateral damage in the terms of people missing out on food benefits, health care costs skyrocketing, federal workers missing pay. They want us to work out a deal. We should do that.
Would you support that type of a compromise, though, an agreement to reopen the government for some period of time with an agreement to then negotiate over health care costs? Is that good enough, or does it need to be in writing on the front end?
I think that's the broad strokes of it, right? Some action on these health care tax credits, getting the government reopened, making sure federal workers are paid. That's the basics that we ought to be able to get through soon, because we are now looking at another paycheck for federal workers that will be zero for so many, and really a lot of pain they're going through.
Well, when you look at the polls, this started out as more people blame Republicans for this shutdown. Now it seems like people are starting to point the finger at both sides almost equally. Does that concern you, particularly as Democrats are about to fight to take back the House and the Senate?
This has never really been about the politics for me. I think it's about wanting our government to take responsible action on funding. Again, I serve in the House. Republicans didn't work to get votes from Democrats. They didn't want our votes. They could have worked in a bipartisan way. I think the people who elected me and sent me and members like me to Congress expect there to be bipartisan work here. I wish that were happening. And again, I think the path out of this is clear. Let's reopen the government. Let's get something done to extend these tax credits.
And how long are you prepared to fight? I mean, here we are. It's about to be November. Some people have expressed concerns that this could go past November 1st when open enrollment starts, and maybe even all the way to Thanksgiving. Are you prepared to hold out that long?
I think that would be a terrible situation for federal workers, many of whom are going to miss a full paycheck the end of this week. And at the same time, when folks are shopping on the exchange, if they're looking for health care, to see these big increases, I'll remind folks who are watching, it's not just people on the exchanges. I've heard from union workers. I've heard from business owners, small business owners especially. They're all seeing health care and premiums increase. So this inaction from Congress is going to have a trickle-down and spillover effect beyond just these Affordable Care Act marketplaces if we don't act now.
All right. Well, we'll watch and wait to see what happens next. Congressman Deluzio, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Coming up after the break, all the president's plans. President Trump takes aim at one of his former investigators and talks about his plans for 2028. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Thank you. Welcome back. President Trump is once again calling on the Justice Department to investigate one of his perceived enemies. This time, former special counsel Jack Smith, who investigated Mr. Trump's role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol and his alleged mishandling of classified documents while out of office. The president posting on social media, quote, "These thugs should all be investigated and put in prison. A disgrace to humanity. Deranged Jack Smith is a criminal," end quote. It comes as the president also told reporters overnight in his clearest terms yet he does not intend to seek an unconstitutional third term in 2028. Look at what he said.
Based on what I read, I guess I'm not allowed to run. So we'll see what happens. And I would say that if you read it, it's pretty clear I'm not allowed to run. It's too bad. I missed him. But we have a lot of great people.
I'm joined now by Eleanor Mueller, who covers Congress for Semaphore, Arshi Siddiqui, Democratic strategist and former senior aide to former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and Doug Heye, former communications director for the RNC and now a Republican strategist. Thanks to all of you for being here. Eleanor, start us off. Help us understand where we are in this discussion over 2028. We have heard President Trump make a range of different comments about 2028 over the course of this past year, really. And his latest comment suggests, he says, I looked at the Constitution, basically I can't do it. But he says he has the best numbers. What do you make of this? Has he shelved that topic? Is he trolling Democrats? What do you think the strategy is here?
It certainly seems like both are true, right? You know, right before Trump told reporters on Air Force One that he was no longer going to do this, Speaker Mike Johnson, who is a constitutional attorney, said that he had talked to Trump, that Trump appreciated that this was not something that was possible. And so whether or not that was something that helped sway him, that conversation, either way now, you know, Trump has said this is really more of a joke. And he said specifically one of these ideas, you know, maybe running as vice president and then ascending to president is something that he doesn't think people would accept.
Well, Doug, that's what we heard from President Trump. But then one of his closest allies, Steve Bannon, was very clear. He said, we have a plan. Trump's running in 2028. I think he said Trump's going to be president in 2028. And people just need to get on board with that. It's hard to know how seriously to take that. What's the discussion inside Republican circles?
Well, he'll be president for 20 days in 2028, and that'll be it.
True.
But the conversation's what it always is. It's about Donald Trump. And so we will revisit this topic again because Trump will, until he closes the door, locks it, and puts bricks over it and says there's no chance that I run or serve, he's going to keep this conversation alive, and we're all going to react to it. His base loves it, and his opponents hate it. Win-win for Donald Trump.
Well, it's a great point. But I guess the question is, are Democrats taking this seriously at all, Archie?
I think there's a lot to take seriously, and I think Doug hit it right on the head in terms of this is all about the base. And this actually then deflects for some of these other issues in terms of affordability, in terms of America First, and what that means for American families.
Yeah, Eleanor, one of the things that we continue to hear from President Trump, he says, look, we've got great people. I assume there he's talking about two people he's talked about quite frequently within this context, his vice president, J.D. Vance, and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Is that how you read those comments?
It is. You know, these are two folks that he's publicly, you know, found some amusement in, almost pitting against each other, you know, teasing them about, I think that you would be a good candidate, or maybe you would be a good candidate. So whether or not that is his endorsement is what really ends up swaying voters, I think is something that everybody will be watching very closely.
We will be. Listen, the vice president was asked about this. This was on a podcast. Let's take a listen, get everyone's reaction on the other side.
I've joked with the secretary about it. So the president first raised this with me probably 6 months or so ago, right? During just, you know, one of our private lunches that we try to get lunch every couple of weeks just to catch up on what's going on and talk about things. He mentioned it probably 6 months or so ago, and I mentioned to the secretary in jest, but it feels so premature because we're still so early.
The president doesn't mention who will go running for president and who vice president. Now, everyone assumes it would be you, but Marco Rubio is 13 years older. He's run for president before. Would there be any tension there?
First of all, no, there's not going to be any tension. Marco is my best friend in the administration. He and I work a lot together.
Right.
Doug, it's just always fascinating to hear. He has talked about it with Secretary Rubio.
Sure. And look, the one thing we know about Donald Trump is he doesn't go anywhere quietly, and he will not go gracefully into that good night. So if there's a point where he says he's not running again, typically for any other president, that means the conversation completely shifts. And we've heard conversations in the past of, will this vice presidential nominee outshine the presidential nominee? That never happens. Donald Trump will never be a lame duck president. He's a YOLO president. And so talk about January 20th. His last minutes are going to be interesting. So if you're any Republican looking to run, how do you start to schedule hiring a staff, making some of those visits to key fundraising people? Forget going to Iowa or New Hampshire. You could do that normally. If you start meeting with fundraising people, Donald Trump has a very big foot that he can put down and make sure that that conversation always goes back to him, even on Election Day.
Yeah, it's a great point. Archie, how do Democrats hear comments like that by the vice president? We're obviously a long ways away from 2028, but everyone has their eye on the midterms and the implications of all of this chatter as we head into the midterms.
Absolutely. It feels a little bit like this, again, a distraction in terms of we're seeing like this apprentice type kind of race for the next nominee. And, you know, Donald Trump is at the center of it. So I think for Democrats, I think the challenge is that Donald Trump is very much of a personality. And does that MAGA base go away because it is a cult of personality? And can one of these Republicans really carry that banner going forward?
We'll have to watch and see. Doug, it comes as President Trump is again adding to, and he's talked about Jack Smith before, but he's saying he should be investigated, he should go to prison, all sorts of other names that he's calling him. What do you think that as this list continues to grow that there is or could be a backlash?
For his base, absolutely not. The backlash comes from people who already don't like him, which isn't then really a backlash. Maybe some independent voters would rather talk about costs. I was going to say, what about those independents, right, who have their eye on the economy? I think that's where all of Washington is trapped right now. No one is really talking about food costs that are rising. Obviously, we're starting to hear some about Obamacare costs and the subsidies. Nobody is really talking about energy prices, and we're about to get into home heating oil season. Those are the things that every politician, Republican or Democrat, should be talking about. But Donald Trump knows he can talk to his base, and they love it all day, every day, and the people who oppose him never do.
Archie, do you think Democrats have been forceful in terms of how they're framing the argument every time President Trump comes out with one of these social media posts calling for one of his political enemies to be jailed? And we should say that in that public post that was meant to be a personal message to Pam Bondi that mentioned Letitia James, that mentioned James Comey and Adam Schiff, 2 out of 3 people on that list have now been indicted.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever seen a president use the bully pulpit in the way Donald Trump has. And so it makes it extremely difficult for Democrats to break through. I mean, they're saying all of these pieces on affordability. They're hearing it back in their districts. When I talk to members, that's what they stress, is that in their districts, there's a backlash. But getting through in the national media has been really difficult.
Eleanor, let's turn to another topic. 5 Republican senators joined Democrats to help pass a resolution that would effectively end the Trump administration's tariffs on Brazil. This is not expected to move through the House. But what does it say about what Congress is willing to do? Is this a potential check on the president's power?
I mean, in a way, no, right? Because the House leaders changed the rules so that this legislation cannot advance in the lower chamber. And so it's never going to be enacted. The Supreme Court is set to hear arguments in a case on this very issue starting next week. Many of those same senators who voted for this resolution last night said that they hope that the justices are the ones to strike down the precedent that's allowing Trump to implement all of these tariffs. Some have said so privately as well. So I think when we see which side the Supreme Court comes out on, that's when it'll be pedal to the metal in terms of who's really willing to put themselves on the line to resist this stuff.
Yeah, it's a great point. But, Doug, it also does send a message that you have these 5 Republicans. You're also seeing some Republicans speak out against the president's strikes on the suspected drug boats, saying that he doesn't have the authority to do that without sign-off from Congress.
You know, Republicans have always been able to speak out on various policies that go against Donald Trump. You just can't do it on things that are very Trumpy. So what's interesting really about this one is that this is on tariffs, which is a very core issue for Donald Trump. Nobody opposed Donald Trump on build the wall, even if the wall hasn't been built. This is a place where it's core to Trump's identity. That's what makes this interesting, even though it's only 5 so far.
Yeah, Archie, final point to you. Is Democrats' only real recourse the courts? I mean, as Eleanor's kind of pointing to.
Well, we also have the 60 votes in the Senate, which we've seen that Republicans aren't even willing to talk to Democrats, let alone negotiate on this shutdown. So I think if anything, there's been this bleeding in terms of there's this unified force in Washington with Republicans in the House and Senate just lockstep with Donald Trump. And so at the end of the day, on the 60 votes, that's the other piece. And that is where, on affordability, Democrats are really putting a hard line in the sand.
All right. The top issue for voters, affordability and the economy. Guys, thank you so much. Great conversation. Eleanor, Archie, and Doug. And up next, death and destruction in the Caribbean as Hurricane Melissa kills dozens, leaving hundreds of thousands of civilians without power and causing catastrophic flooding in Jamaica, Haiti, and Cuba as the system zeroes in on the Bahamas. You're watching Meet the Press now. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are continuing to track Hurricane Melissa as it wreaks devastation across the Caribbean. The storm is moving offshore from Cuba and toward the Bahamas. This is some of the devastation Melissa caused in Cuba, where it made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane, as forecasters warned of a storm surge of up to 12 feet. More than 700,000 people evacuated ahead of the storm's arrival. Meanwhile, recovery efforts are underway in Jamaica after Melissa made landfall yesterday as a Cat 5 storm with winds of 185 miles per hour. It's the most powerful hurricane ever to hit the island in its record history. Officials there saying it's still too early to determine the full extent of the damage, but more than 3/4 of the entire country without electricity as of this morning. NBC News correspondent George Solis got a closer look at some of the cleanup efforts taking place there right now.
So we're on a highway right now heading into western Jamaica, some of the hardest hit areas. This is what Jamaican police are doing where the road is blocked. You can see they have chainsaws here trying to clear as much debris from the roadway here to let cars pass. Officials telling us even they don't know just how bad some of the roadways are as of this hour. They are going little by little, assessing street and road case by case.
And we appreciate that reporting from George Solis. And joining us now is reporter Ed Augustin, who's in Havana. Ed, thank you so much for joining us. Describe the devastation that Melissa has caused in Cuba so far.
The damage in eastern Cuba has been extensive. The hurricane has now left Cuba, headed north. But even in many parts of eastern Cuba, I've just got off the phone to people, it's still raining and it's still raining hard. So, for example, in Holguin province, which was the last province that the hurricane hit, there's been flash flooding. Rivers have overflown. In the main city, there's flooding. People are having to move right now. furniture, televisions onto the second floors when they've got them because the floodwaters are all around. That's right in the middle of the city. In that province, over 200,000 people were evacuated. Not enough, it seems, to spare the city of huge damage. In Santiago de Cuba, there were mudslides last night, and in Granma, another eastern province, both in rural areas and in the cities, there were houses that have collapsed. So there were huge evacuations that took place before this. It's amazing that the state found the resources to do it. Over 700,000 people were moved to safety, but that hasn't stopped a huge amount of damage to Cuba's infrastructure and to people's property.
Yeah, and we're just looking at some of those devastating images right now, the flooding, the houses that have collapsed. And Cuba's infrastructure, obviously in focus, power grids in particular, had been a reason for concern even before the storm hit. Are those issues hampering recovery efforts?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to point out that Cuba's infrastructure is in a parlous state, partially because Cuba's economy, centrally planned economy, doesn't work, hasn't worked for decades, but also ever since 2019, successive U.S. administrations, first Trump, then Biden, now Trump again, have ratcheted up that long-standing U.S. economic warfare, and that particularly targets infrastructure. So, for example, the Cuban state has deployed 2,500 electrical engineers to the eastern provinces, but they're going to be working without all of the parts they need because these sanctions cost, according to economists, billions of dollars a year for a very poor country that can barely afford to feed its population. And so for those first responders that are risking their lives trying to get electricity back online, trying to get hydration salts for people, trying to make sure that people can get back safely to their houses, their efforts, normal Cubans' efforts to protect their fellow Cubans' lives are directly undermined by these sanctions. It's worth bearing in mind the better off Cubans aren't people that have to be evacuated. It's the poorer people, the people that live in flimsy wooden houses that have zinc roofs. They're the ones that are really feeling the impact of this right now.
All right, Ed Augustin, thank you for that report. Please stay safe. We really appreciate it. And still to come, fear and fallout in the Middle East after Israel conducts a series of deadly airstrikes on Gaza after accusing Hamas of violating the ceasefire deal, which Hamas denies. We have the very latest from Tel Aviv. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Concerns are mounting over the fragile ceasefire in the Middle East. Israel announcing today that the peace agreement is back on after it carried out dozens of airstrikes across the Gaza Strip. This was the deadliest 24 hours in Gaza since the ceasefire was brokered earlier this month. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the strikes after accusing Hamas of violating the agreement, accusing the group of failing to return the bodies of dead hostages and firing on Israeli troops, which Hamas denies. President Trump addressed the strikes from Air Force One late last night, saying the ceasefire is not in jeopardy. NBC News International correspondent Matt Bradley has the very latest on where things stand from Tel Aviv.
Yeah, Kristen, well, I don't want to say that all is well here in the Holy Land, but it does look as though ever since 10 a.m., the guns over Gaza have definitely subsided. That's when the Israelis declared that they were going to go back to adhering to that ceasefire, such a hard-won deal by the Trump administration that's now been in place for nearly 3 weeks. This is the second violation, and it really did look as though it was the most strenuous challenge to the integrity of this ceasefire ever since it was put into place back on October 10th. This time, we saw that the Israelis launched airstrikes all up and down the Gaza Strip, killing, according to Palestinian health officials in Gaza, more than 100 people, nearly half of them children. Now, as we're seeing, despite these clashes, despite the complaints from the Israelis that Hamas and other militant groups have violated the terms of the ceasefire, it looks as though we're hearing from Hamas themselves, President Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister's office. We heard from them that everybody is trying to stick to this ceasefire deal. No one wants to go back to an all-out war, despite the explosion of violence that we've seen over the past day. Now, this started yesterday when we heard from the Israelis that militants, and we don't know who they were, that they had fired RPGs over the so-called yellow line, to which the Israelis had retreated as part of this ceasefire. And we learned later that they had killed one soldier who happens to be an Israeli American. Now, this was enough of an incident to get the Israelis to respond, but there was also the problem, the abiding issue, of these bodies. Hamas has so far not returned enough of the corpses of the hostages. There were 28 in total who were supposed to be returned as part of this deal. 13 still remain. And the Israelis did release footage yesterday that they said was shot by a drone that showed Hamas operatives trying to fake the discovery of one of these bodies. Now, this has sparked outrage among top officials here in Israel, and it was one of the reasons why they went back, the Israelis, to launching airstrikes against the Gaza Strip. They said against Hamas targets. And we just heard the Israelis said that they released a list of 25 people who they said were top terrorists who they targeted and killed in this day of operations. Now, considering what has happened, considering that this ceasefire still endures despite all of the odds, it looks as though this is a durable deal. We may see this again, but it seems as though all of the parties are committed to sticking to something like peace. Kristen?
Extraordinary there. All right, Matt Bradley, thank you for that report. We are back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but there is more ahead on NBC News Now.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.